Okay, I got it going. All right. Well, let's see. So we will go over each issue, PFAS contamination. We also have a message from Congresswoman Ross in that regard, which I will share with you all at that time. Lead remediation and testing in the state, Duke's coal ash cleanup, the wood pellet industry in North Carolina, and then questions and answers. If you have questions during any one of the issues, please ask them then. We'll have some time during each issue to address initial questions and then time at the end for any final questions. And so please introduce yourself in the chat. I'm going to drop all this info in the chat as well, so you don't have to remember everything on this slide. Feel free to share your pronouns, where you're calling from, and what you are most excited about learning today. If you feel comfortable coming on video, we would love to see your faces. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. If you want to come off mute to ask a question, simply type stack in the chat box, and we will address the stack in order. If you don't want to come off mute, you can type your question in the chat box, and we will address it in the same order. Lastly, we will be recording this call for those that couldn't make it. So if you do not want your video recorded, you should keep it off. And first things first, I would like to introduce all of our panelists today. If our panelists could come off mute and just say a little bit about themselves as I announce them. First, we have Emily Donovan with Clean Cape Fear.
Hi, happy to be here. Co-founder of Clean Cape Fear. We're a grassroots community group located in the Wilmington, North Carolina area. We formed almost 5 years ago in response to learning of outrageous amounts of PFAS chemicals in the Cape Fear River, the primary source of our drinking water.
We also have Connor Kippe with us from Toxic Free NC.
Hey all, I'm the policy advocate at Toxic Free NC. We're an environmental health advocacy organization that primarily works on a lot of the issues that we're talking about tonight, and pesticides as well. And I use the pronouns he, him.
Ed Norman with NC DHHS.
Hey, I'm a government bureaucrat in the Division of Public Health, but we've been busy testing child care centers this past year, and have some new funding for testing schools and for remediation, mitigation. Amazing.
I'm going to stop real quick and ask, does anyone hear an echo coming through perhaps my computer? Okay, good, because I do have the sound shared. I just want to make sure it's not an echo. Vikki Crouse with NC Child.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vikki Crouse, she, her, and I lead our research work at NC Child. I also lead our Lead-Free NC campaign that's focused on reducing childhood lead exposure. And NC Child is a statewide nonprofit agency that promotes public policies that improve child and family well-being.
Next is Nick Torrey with SELC, the Southern Environmental Law Center.
Hey there, everyone. I'm Nick Torrey. I'm here in Chapel Hill at Southern Environmental Law Center. I'm an attorney here, and I've worked on coal ash basically since I started at SELC after graduating from law school back in 2011. So it's been a little over 10 years.
And then Erin Carey with Sierra Club.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Carey with North Carolina Sierra Club, she, her, hers. I'm located in Wilmington, and I am our Coastal Programs Director. Sierra Club is the largest environmental organization in the country, and North Carolina Sierra Club is just one chapter of that. But we'll be talking about wood pellets today, which we've been working on since I can remember.
Fantastic. And I've reached out to Congresswoman Deborah Ross to see if she could join us today. She had a busy schedule and was not able to be on the call, but she did have a quick message to share with everyone, which I'm going to play now.
Hello, League of Conservation Voters. This is Deborah Ross from the 2nd Congressional District. Thank you for all you do in North Carolina, particularly to make sure that we have clean, safe drinking water. I am your partner in this in Congress and have been working very hard to make sure that we both identify and clean up PFAS, those forever chemicals. Now, you know that the House included in the infrastructure bill ways of being able to clean up PFAS and make sure that water systems that have been doing this can also get compensated. I've worked on this in a bipartisan way with Congressman Hudson. I've also introduced legislation to make sure that we can identify more of the kinds of PFAS that we're seeing. And we are taking this extremely seriously. North Carolina has suffered from PFAS contamination, in particular our military communities. I will be a partner with you all the way through. Thank you for everything that you're doing.
And can everyone see my screen? Classic question. I'm not sure if my screen share worked. Does everyone see the panelist screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so to kick things off with PFAS contamination, and Deborah Ross worked on the PFAS HR 2467, the PFAS Action Act, which is a national initiative to address PFAS, but North Carolina in particular has several PFAS issues. So just to kick it off, I know PFAS, what does it stand for, right? It's per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. Try to say that 5 times fast. I've tried to practice it since coming onto this call and I still can't do it. They're often called forever chemicals because they do not naturally degrade and there is currently no proven safe disposal method. They're highly persistent and the best available science is leading many to believe that PFAS are toxic at even trace amounts. Their applications range from pizza boxes to nonstick pans and firefighting foams. It's literally found almost everywhere. And so what does that mean? People who have certain types of PFAS exposure have health effects that include cancers, cholesterol diseases, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and thyroid disease, amongst others. And how does it affect North Carolina? A chemical plant along the Cape Fear River, first owned by DuPont, now owned by Chemours, has been releasing large quantities of PFAS through their wastewater, discharging this chemical waste into the river and contaminating the drinking water supply for over 350,000 residents downstream who rely on the Cape Fear River as their primary source of drinking water. They also believe that PFAS found in the air coming from Chemours is contaminating the groundwater when precipitation occurs, which explains why it's being found in over 6,000 private wells surrounding the Fayetteville manufacturing facility. Along the Deep and Hall Rivers, high levels are also contaminating drinking water supplies from unidentified sources who send their manufacturing waste to the city of Burlington's sewer system. So over 1.5 million North Carolinians from Pittsburgh to Wilmington are affected by PFAS contamination from the Cape Fear River alone. And we have Emily Donovan and Connor Kippe to give us a little more information on PFAS. Emily, if you want to kick things off.
Sure, happy to be here. I think one of the most interesting things, not interesting, it's devastating because I raised my children on contaminated drinking water. But what is interesting is that we're just learning about this chemistry. The chemical industry has done a fantastic job of hiding the chemistry and then burying the effects, the toxic effects that they researched internally. And still today, we're even learning to the extent that these corporations went to hide this information. Now, currently in North Carolina, my region became publicly aware of this when we learned about one chemical called Gen X. We found this in our drinking water in really large, alarming quantities back in 2017. And since then, we've been on a mission as a community group to try and make sure that this never happens again to another community, not just in North Carolina, but nationally. So we partner up with incredible organizations like the ones on this call to try and continue to push for regulatory changes and protections, as well as holding our elected leaders accountable. Some important things to point out is that we are working right now to try and learn about the toxic effects of this chemistry. So we know we're being exposed, but what we don't know is what those exposures mean. And so we created a petition. When I say we, I mean Clean Cape Fear, along with 5 other North Carolina environmental and social justice groups, petitioned the EPA to use their full authority under the Toxic Substance Control Act to require Chemours pay for human health studies, cancer studies, and toxicological studies on at least 54 of these chemicals that we identified in our water, food, air, soil, and even blood. So we are actively litigating because unfortunately that petition was not fully granted. And so now we are suing the EPA to encourage them to do what they are legally obligated to do per Congress. Now, one thing that I want to just point out, and then we'll move on to Connor, is that this contamination, I know Representative Ross said that it impacts military communities, and that is very true. It does impact from firefighting foam used on military bases. That has been a large concern. What we haven't seen is a lot of those numbers in North Carolina. Our focus has really been on the industrial contamination side, but we are aware that there has been military use and military contamination. It just might not have impacted the drinking water supply for North Carolinians nearly as high as the industrial component. But I'm happy to address any questions later on that anyone has about this topic. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Connor, if you want to tell us a little bit about Toxic Free NC and the work that you all are doing around PFAS.
Yeah, Emily did a great job of covering a lot of different stuff there. The lawsuit that she specifically talked about the petition with the EPA, Toxic Free NC is one of the other named petitioners on that case. And so we're helping out in that regard. We also, to fill out a little bit more of why PFAS is sort of a complex thing to regulate, it's because PFAS is about 9,000 different chemicals. It's more of a family than it is any one specific group. And like Emily was saying, we know what some older legacy versions, their health effects, but we don't know the sort of continuing health effects of some of the newer chemistries that are coming out all the time. And so Toxic Free, both at the state and federal level, helps lobby around either different like programmatic rule changes in agencies or different actions of new legislation that can help us do that better. And one specific focus area for us, because Toxic Free NC is largely concerned with pesticide use in North Carolina, is that it's actually recently been discovered in about the last 2 years in many other states that a fair amount of the pesticides that we're using are essentially like leaching PFAS out of their containers. The PFAS is a thing that helps prevent escapes of liquids and sort of reduces surface adhesion with liquids. It gets a little complicated chemically. But a big area that we'll be focusing on this year is trying to investigate sort of what that PFAS and pesticides overlap looks like in North Carolina. And I'm also happy to take any questions regarding any of that as well as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys, for sharing. Okay, yeah, we don't currently have any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to lead testing and remediation. And if any questions come up, we can address them towards the end. So lead testing and remediation. Lead, as most people know, but not everyone, is a potent neurotoxin that can impair a child's cognitive ability and development. Children can be exposed to lead in a number of ways, but drinking water is one of the most common vectors. And for decades, schools in North Carolina have not been able to test for lead in their water supply due to the cost. While state legislation has minimum requirements of lead found through testing drinking water, there's been no requirement for testing in schools. In 2019, the North Carolina Department of Public Health adopted a rule requiring childcare facilities to test drinking water for lead every 3 years, which is a big change and definitely a good step in the right direction. But we also are going to be seeing funding from the American Rescue Plan Act to help us start testing soon and replace fixtures in schools, public schools. And so we have Vikki Crouse and Ed Norman here to talk with us about that. Vikki, if you want to kick things off.
Sure, happy to. And so NC Child, you know, the thing about the 2019 public health rule is that that was something that NC Child, the Division of Public Health, and especially Ed's team, Duke and RTI International worked together to achieve, because prior to that, as you noted, you know, North Carolina, you know, doesn't still have many laws or regulations that help to catch lead before children are exposed. And so particularly when it comes to drinking water, childcare facilities and other, you know, public schools weren't catching lead in drinking water before a child was lead poisoned. And so this public health rule is a really big milestone for North Carolina. And I have to say that, you know, our public health officials have been working for more than 30 years to eliminate childhood lead poisoning, and we've come really far in doing so. In reality, children's lead risk in North Carolina is pretty low. It's about 1% of kids who are found to be lead poisoned every year. The thing about this is that it's an equity issue. The risks of lead that remain are among, you know, pockets of exposure across the state that are often in lower income neighborhoods where older housing and buildings mean that old lead paint and lead pipes are still in use. And so children still face a higher risk of lead exposure in those places. But I will let Ed talk a little bit more about, you know, the public health rule and even, you know, exciting place where we are now with the most recent state budget and how the General Assembly approved millions of dollars in federal funds to be used to test and remove lead in drinking water at childcare centers and public schools.
Yeah, so this is Ed Norman again. Thank you, Vikki. Great partner. I should have given a little more background. I'm not just a bureaucrat. I think Vikki was referring to me when she said the state has been working, members of the state have been working for more than 30 years on childhood lead poisoning prevention. I've been either the epidemiologist or the program manager for the childhood lead poisoning prevention program for 32 years. And I'm not a water guru, but we have been heavily involved in water lately. As is mentioned in the slides, you know, we've focused on lead paint for many, many years, and, you know, look for all sorts of other sources when we identify children who are poisoned. Too many to list at the moment. But in terms of water, as a result of the rule from 2019, we have now tested more than 90% of all licensed child care centers. Just a minor comment, partly from the work that NC Child has done in the aftermath of that rule, we've actually lowered the water action level for it. It's not a statewide action level. It only applies, you know, in situations where a child has been poisoned or at child occupied facilities like child care centers and public schools, well, all schools. It's been lowered from the 15 part per billion action level that the EPA has had, and really is unjustified, you know, in terms of how high it is. We were not able to get it quite as low as we wanted, but we found a sponsor in the legislature, and I should say NC Child did, and it has been lowered to 10 parts per billion at this point, which has made a significant difference and will make a difference as we start testing schools. So there are just some minimum results that the report from the child care testing. What we know is that about a little over 2% of the samples that we collected were elevated at that EPA standard of 15. That was the standard while we were testing child care centers. So we didn't, you know, have to regulatorily step in and make them do things unless it was 15 or greater. We couldn't. I mean, not that we might not want to. But now if we were to do that testing again, and we will because it's periodic testing, the standard is now 10, at which point they would need to take some kind of remedial action. And that occurred last December. The 10 part per billion action level went into effect. So at that level, we have data on all 4,000 childcare centers that we've tested. It would have been more like 3%, a little over 3% of the samples that we collected would have been elevated. So almost 50% more than at the 15 part per billion level. But more than that, what we're mainly finding is we've found very few childcare centers where it was a system-wide, contamination, every faucet in the place. Which is something you would expect if it were related to something like lead service lines or some kind of bad plumbing, situation within the facility where there was lots of copper plumbing and soldering that leaches lead. What we've primarily been doing to remediate the problems is replacing drinking water fountains. So we've been doing a lot of drinking water fountain replacement in childcare facilities. And in the occasional situation where that was not sufficient, we have required filtration, some kind of under the sink filtration device. So that's it on childcare. With schools, the big news is that we have these new ARPA funds. The legislature, man, I never would have thought. They approved $150 million to do testing for water, lead paint, and asbestos in public schools and all licensed child care facilities. In addition, for the money that we don't spend to test them, it is available for mitigation. So we're trying to come up with a budget, trying to figure out how much it's going to cost us to test all these facilities. And some schools have some asbestos data, so we may be able to use some of the existing data and hopefully lower the cost of testing so that there's more money available for mitigation. But that all is kind of timely that this meeting is happening. We're in the middle of the public comment period for those temporary rules that we proposed temporary rules which do require schools, public schools, to test for water and for lead and asbestos as the state law required. And any kind of positive commentary that we receive in that regard always helps in terms of getting even temporary rules adopted. What the rules will do is lay out who's eligible for the funds, how they go about applying for the funds, and then what kinds of things they have to do in order to be eligible for the funds. Like you've got to test first. You got to confirm that you have a hazard. You can't just go out and do asbestos abatement, if you want to call it that, hire an asbestos contractor, and then there's no asbestos in the school. We're not going to pay for that. They're just probably trying to get some renovation cost covered if they're doing that sort of thing. So they got to show that there's a problem. And then there's a couple of barriers that I'm not really sure how they got in the statute. Somebody might have wanted to reduce the effectiveness. For public schools, there's a local match requirement to access the mitigation funds, but only for lead paint abatement and for asbestos. And it's a $1 match for every $2 that they draw down. So that's unfortunately going to be a barrier, and probably a bigger barrier in places that need it the most, those poor school districts. So we're trying to figure out how to best prioritize the use of the mitigation funds. I'm probably way out of time, but I can forward some information to Jean-Luc and about the public comment period, but and how to get comments. Hopefully supporting that. We set up a system so that schools are required to do this testing. It also requires, by the way, child care facilities to do testing for lead paint and for asbestos, because basically none of those facilities have ever been tested for any of those. And we've tested most of them now at this point for water, so I guess they didn't include requirement for water testing since it's already been done. And I'll shut up.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I just have an initial question. So I think you said $150 million from the state legislature has been allocated for testing and remediation. And that's a separate fund, like separate amount of funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. Is that true?
No, that is funding.
Okay.
That they have to approve it for the
Got
use.
it.
And so they approved, it was the governor's proposal.
Gotcha.
And somehow it survived through the legislative process. It was reduced slightly from what the governor proposed, but yeah, so that's what it's all federal funding.
Got it. Okay, fantastic. And George asked, in the George McDowell in chat asked, is the new normal that 1 child in 100 is lead poisoned? I think that was in reference to one of the statistics earlier. George, I want to ask you to clarify that. By new normal, what do you mean exactly? Do you mean like it's acceptable? Or we have to just deal with the fact that that's how it is? Is that what your question is? And you can come off mute, George, if you want to.
Yeah, hi, John Luke. The speaker mentioned, this was jarring to me. The speaker mentioned that the rate of lead poisoning in children was 1%, and that was low. And that was jarring to me.
I think she was speaking relatively to other states. It is low compared to Massachusetts.
Right, or like
Illinois.
Michigan.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it's not unacceptable, the level that it is still. We see about 500 confirmed cases of what we call elevated blood lead levels each year in the state, and the CDC just lowered the action level in October. So we're anticipating seeing about 2,000 kids at the new blood lead reference value that the CDC announced annually. Those are new cases.
Thank you.
My external display just shut off, so my screen might have just flickered out. Yep, sorry about that. Give me 1 second here, technical difficulties. But I know Hayden had asked a question, and I know that Vikki had answered the first part of it, but I think the second part was that he was worried about whether or not residential was also an issue here. Can you guys speak to that let's see, where did it go? Yes, is it likely that that where schools and childcare facilities are contaminated, residential is also contaminated? Can you guys speak to that at all?
So I can sort of speak to that issue. Vikki, do you want me to start? So we actually, our division proposed an amendment to the bill that was ultimately passed that would set aside $10 million of the $150 million to do residential housing remediation, abatement, for lead specifically, because I manage a program where we identify 500 kids a year, with elevated lead exposures, and there are no resources other than there's HUD grants that some cities have been able to get, which it's hard to really tie them to homes where lead poisoned children live. So what we were hoping is that we could get a set aside that would be for those cases, and they did not go along with it. Because it wasn't in the original proposal, and I don't know why. But yeah, even in terms of water, yeah, you would expect that you would have a similar level of elevations. The 2% at 15 parts per billion, or the 3% at 10 parts per billion in residential faucets, just like we were seeing in at these childcare centers. And that's because we haven't really run into the issue of lead service lines yet, as they have, in some of the northern states. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's. I mean, that could be proven wrong, as we go down the road, But we've been able to resolve most of the elevated water levels by replacing the drinking water fountain.
Yeah, and if folks are curious to know kind of where we see the highest areas of risk for lead exposure in North Carolina, on the campaign site Lead Free NC, there's actually a map that we created that shows those areas, and you can overlay a layer of data on the blood lead levels among kids who've been tested. Those are specifically kids who are enrolled in Medicaid, who are required to be tested at a young age. And you can also see where, we have children who are ages 0 to 5, because again, that's a population that we're particularly concerned about, as lead exposure in that life stage has really big impacts on development and outcomes in later life.
Fantastic. And so, not that the issue is fantastic, but thank you for your answers. Is this related to the age of facilities and the fountains for the most part? Is a question from Dawn in the chat.
Yeah, totally. For drinking water faucets, they really were not made lead-free until 2014. And it's only been the last 7 or 8 years where the level of lead that was allowed in faucet materials was reduced from 8%, which was a significant amount previously. So yeah, pre-2014, but that's a lot. That's a whole lot of facilities are going to have higher water lead levels most likely than the newer facilities. With paint, it goes back much farther. 1978 is when they restricted paint content of lead in paint for residential purposes. We don't know if it really applies to paint at schools and at childcare centers that are in commercial buildings, because the ban has never applied to them. We think the availability of lead paint is a lot less now, but they still use it for a lot of industrial purposes. So, it's not, we're going to find out over the course of the next couple of years, if it is strictly based on, the age of the property. And it's so difficult with some schools because there have been, renovations at different stages of the life of the school. And, you got a construction date that's 50 years ago, but most of the school might be only 10 years old. So it's nobody, there's just never been an inventory, which is my great hope, is that I don't know if folks are going to be able to overcome that barrier for, the local match, but I know we're going to be able to get a complete inventory of hazards at schools and childcare centers over the next couple of years. And that's my hope, that, the testing and the inspections that we do will be as close to complete, or at least as much so as we've done with water at childcare centers.
And I think you may have just answered Julia's question a little bit. She had asked, for the licensed childcare centers, does that include home daycares or only standalone facilities? So I guess if someone's running their own business as a daycare out of their home or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some licensed childcare centers can be in a residence. You can have up to 13 children, so they're limited in the size that they can be. However, there's a whole nother category of really small licensed, they call them family childcare homes, that are all residential, but they're limited to like 6 or 7 kids. So yeah, there's 1,300 of those little bitty ones, the family childcare homes. We haven't tested any of those because we don't. The reason we focused on childcare centers is that we're able to monitor the results, because all of those childcare centers, they're inspected every 6 months by the local health department. And they act as our agents basically to monitor that they document that they did the testing. And if they did the testing, it was less than, the action level. We're not able to do that for the family childcare homes because there's no inspection process, at least through the health department where we have connections, that would allow us to do that. We do plan to test them. We currently have an EPA grant and we are trying to test them, but it's all on a voluntary basis. There's not a requirement that those family childcare homes, the smallest residential facilities, be tested. They will be eligible for the mitigation funds that have been made available through ARPA. Just the requirement is that they be a licensed facility. So whether they're one of the bigger standalone commercial buildings, one of the residential or either type of residential facility that I just described, they're all going to be eligible for the mitigation fund.
We do have 2 more questions, but in the interest of time, I've got them saved for the end. And we are going to move on to Duke Energy's coal ash cleanup now. Thank you both, Vikki and Ed. So for those that don't know, coal ash is a byproduct of burning coal, and it can contain high levels of toxic contaminants like mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. For years, Duke Energy has stored coal ash in unlined pits that leak into the groundwater. Most notably, in 2014, a drainage pipe burst at a Duke coal ash containment site, releasing 39,000 tons of liquefied coal ash into the Dan River. This event led to the state legislature requiring Duke Energy to close all of their unlined coal ash facilities by 2029, in addition to cleanup costs from the Dan River and other related spills, such as the 2018 Cape Fear River spill. And I'd like to kick it over to Nick Torrey from SELC, who has been working on the litigation side of things when it comes to this. Nick, what can you tell us about the current state of the coal ash cleanup and I guess the legal fight in general?
Yeah, so let me, first of all, hi everyone, thanks for being here. And let me just, sort of recap how we got here to explain sort of what have been the recent developments. As Jean-Luc said, coal ash contains all these dangerous toxic pollutants, is the second largest industrial waste stream in the country. And the unlined leaking coal ash pits are frequently located not just in contact with groundwater where they contaminate groundwater supplies, but also on the banks of rivers and lakes. So they're often contaminating those waters as well. And the issue, you mentioned closure being required under state law and required under federal law too, as it happens now. But the issue is, how will these lagoons be closed? And that's what all of our fight has been about, because the ash often has buried streams running through it. It's saturated in the groundwater, beneath the groundwater table. So if the utility does what they want to do, which is to close by putting a cover on top, the ash remains saturated underneath and continues to leach out those metals and other pollutants into the surrounding waterways. So the only way to stop that pollution is to remove the ash, get it out of the groundwater, and put it into dry-lined modern landfill storage or safe recycling in order to stop that pollution. So that's what the whole fight has been about. And so we started in South Carolina doing our work back in 2011. We got some sites locked in for cleanups in South Carolina, and then we started working in North Carolina. And both states had very serious problems at each of their coal ash sites that had been ignored by the state agencies for decades. Drinking water supplies contaminated, dam safety problems that are very serious, structural problems. But unlike in South Carolina, in North Carolina, what our experience was that the state actually intervened to try to block us from enforcing the Clean Water Act in federal court. Fortunately, that was unsuccessful, and we were able to bring our Clean Water Act enforcement actions and also state enforcement actions on behalf of conservation groups and their members all over North Carolina. But that context of the state, basically trying to protect Duke Energy and make our enforcement actions go away with a sweetheart settlement deal, all have played out prior to the Dan River coal ash spill that you mentioned in 2014. So when that happened and there was all this national attention focused on North Carolina coal ash, it was a tremendous part of the story that the state had been basically trying to protect Duke Energy at the expense of people. And it led to a lot of public outrage and scrutiny of both Duke Energy and also of the state environmental agency. There was a criminal prosecution of Duke Energy that led to them having to plead guilty to criminal violations of the Clean Water Act. The state coal ash law that you mentioned was passed, which required a couple of things. In addition to closure, it required extensive studies that documented more and more problems that we were able to then use to fuel our enforcement actions and get more progress made towards cleanups. And it also required extensive testing of people's drinking water wells who lived around many of these sites, and found that many of those drinking water wells were contaminated with hexavalent chromium and other pollutants, which led to another round of public scandal when it came out that after the Department of Health and Human Services had properly issued warnings to people not to use their drinking water, the governor's office had actually interfered with those and tried to change those warnings and undo them. So with all of that public pressure and all of our litigation and a series of legal victories that we had in state and federal court, by 2019, beginning of 2019, we had out of the 14 sites in North Carolina, 8 of them committed to be cleaned up through settlement agreements in our federal and state litigation. And we had 6 sites left that we were still fighting about, including the largest sites in the state. And that's where the state coal ash law and the leadership of the Cooper administration and Secretary Regan at the Department of Environmental Quality came in, because they actually made a determination that those remaining sites needed to be excavated to get the ash out of the groundwater, just as we had been saying for years and the state had been opposing us on, but they came around after everything that happened and made those closure determinations. Duke then challenged those. And so we had a whole other round of litigation in which Duke was trying to fight those cleanup orders. But we joined forces with the state. We got some more victories in court on those, and Duke ultimately had to agree to clean up those remaining 6 sites. And that happened right at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. So we had a consent order finalized in February of 2020, just before everything shut down, that required those remaining cleanups. And as a result of all of that, North Carolina is leading the nation in cleaning up coal ash. We have 126 million tons of coal ash that's going to be cleaned up. That's the largest of any state by far. 3 sites in North Carolina are already complete. The cleanups are done. The ash is sealed up in dry line landfills. 3 others are underway with recycling, which is an exciting way to eliminate the pollution problems by actually reprocessing the ash and using it as an ingredient in concrete, which is a valuable construction material that the pollution is bound up so it doesn't leach out. That's been studied extensively. And another benefit of that is that it actually generates less greenhouse gases than conventional concrete manufacturing. So those recycling processes are happening in Goldsboro, in Salisbury, and then just south of where I am in Chatham County. There's more coal ash recycling happening down at a site in Lumberton as well. So far, we've had about 26 million tons cleaned up. And as I said, the state is really leading the nation in cleanups, and the Southeast is leading the nation in cleanups as well. Some recent developments beyond that. One is an issue that's sort of a little bit separate from the cleanups, but has to do with management of coal ash and coal ash pollution, which is that at many of these sites, the utilities already had more modern coal ash landfills to store the new ash that they're generating today as they continue, unfortunately, to burn coal. And those landfills do have to manage wastewater because they're open to the rainfall and stuff, which the wastewater can and it should be treated to remove pollutants under the Clean Water Act. But unfortunately, yet again, our state environmental agency has recently proposed in some new permits to let Duke Energy dump that wastewater untreated into the waterways in Charlotte and near Roxborough, even though both the Environmental Protection Agency and a federal court of appeals have made clear in recent years that that is unlawful. So we've pushed DEQ to change course again, fix that approach, and actually require treatment for that wastewater, as they should be doing. DEQ is sitting on those draft permits. We're not sure whether they're going to do the right thing or not. We're going to be watching that very closely. Another and very exciting development is that I mentioned Secretary Regan, who led the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina. He then went last year to run the Environmental Protection Agency. And that agency, and he brought his North Carolina coal ash experience to bear. And so that agency is now enforcing the federal coal ash rule that was originally passed under the Obama administration, and has performance standards that also require the common sense thing of not allowing utilities to close their coal ash lagoons when the ash is sitting in groundwater. But those standards hadn't been enforced before. So Secretary Regan and the Environmental Protection Agency are now enforcing those at some sites around the country and setting a strong signal to all the utilities nationwide that they cannot do this. So for some of our states in the Southeast where utilities have resisted cleanups and there are many sites that are dangerous and polluting and are not yet on track to be cleaned up in Georgia and Alabama, Tennessee, we are hopeful that EPA's actions are going to lead to more coal ash cleanups happening in those states. And it may also lead to additional groundwater cleanups in North Carolina, because another thing EPA has said is that utilities actually have to treat the groundwater or show that it will naturally be bound up in the soils and not ever escape. They cannot just let it run out into the surrounding waterways and use that as a method of supposed groundwater treatment. So EPA is requiring more real action to deal with groundwater contamination, and that may also have some benefits for North Carolina. So that's sort of where things stand. We've come a very long way in the time that I've been working on this, and it's been the story of kind of regulatory agencies failing to protect people, and instead, unfortunately, protecting the polluters for many years. But once people really, had the facts and made their voices heard, that public pressure has been the single biggest force driving these cleanup victories. And all the people who came out to public meetings, submitted comments, and raised hell, really have, I think, brought things around to the point where we could have this tremendous situation that we have now, where all of our coal ash is being cleaned up. I think there's reason to be optimistic about a lot of the other issues that we're hearing about today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for all of that. We're going to move on to our last issue that we're going to talk about, which is the wood pellet industry in North Carolina, which when I had reached out to Sierra Club and Erin, I did not know that the wood pellet industry was actually a water issue. Not like I know of it as a forest issue. And so just to kind of give a brief background, and then I'll kick it over to Erin. So wood pellets are burned to produce energy and are in demand in Europe as a clean, renewable energy source. The industry claims that it is a climate-friendly energy source despite emissions from combustion. And producing wood pellets involves clear-cutting forests. Outside of other environmental issues, the industry impacts water quality through wastewater discharge. And of course, clear-cutting forests undermines the ecosystem's natural ability to filter water. Erin, could you tell us a little bit more about the wood pellet industry?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. We'll start, I guess, and in the interest of time, I'll try to shorten some of this backstory, but how North Carolina got into the situation it's in right now with regard to the wood pellet industry started back in 2009 when the European Union classified the burning of wood pellets as carbon neutral. So this was when they were trying to set goals to cut carbon emissions by 20% of their 1990 levels by the year 2020. So this was a while ago, but the same accounting is still in place. And when I tell you the story of how a tree becomes wood pellet, which is it starts out as a tree, is cut down with all of its thousands of brethren, put on a truck, shipped to a pellet manufacturing facility, which is, at least in North Carolina, absolutely in an environmental justice community, processed into pellets, put on another truck, shipped to the port, put on a barge, shipped across the ocean, and burned in coal burning power plants that have been converted to burn wood pellets in the UK so they can make electricity. So when you understand that is how we make wood pellet, the idea that this is a carbon neutral energy source comes into question. So the governments of the European Union really wanted to kick off this new carbon neutral energy source they had. So they pushed a lot of subsidies onto the industry and helped create a whole large scale pellet industry. And it was propped up by taxpayer dollars. So the industry, seeing dollar signs, was very excited, and they came over to the United States and settled in the American South, mostly in the Southeast, which is how we got to where we are. They wanted to be here for a couple of different reasons. One, we have abundant forests. Two, most of that forest land is privately owned, so the companies wouldn't be disturbed by, pesky things like government intervention. There's one major player for wood pellets in North Carolina. The company's name is Enviva. And Enviva started quickly contacting private landowners to lease their land and clear cut it. So when I say clear cut, I mean, it's not scrap wood, it's not sawdust, it's not selective logging, it is 100% a clear cut. And if all you have to do is Google wood pellet clear cuts, and you'll see the devastation that is reaped by these. And it doesn't matter if it's a pine savanna, it doesn't matter if it's a bottomland hardwood. Enviva doesn't care if it's an important ecosystem or not. In fact, over 1 million acres of US trees have been cut to clear for biomass to date. So we talk about water quality and how important trees are to water quality. And there's a lot of environmental concerns around the wood pellet industry. As you might imagine, air quality, certainly environmental justice, loss of biodiversity, and this is not really good for our climate goals. But as far as water quality is concerned, there's direct and indirect impacts from this industry. The direct impacts, as Jean-Luc mentioned, come from the wastewater discharge. When water is used in this process and as it is, it picks up chemicals from the wood and from the process itself and has to be flushed out as wastewater, which has to be held somewhere. Often this water is held in unlined ponds. And as with coal ash and even PFAS, we all know what water likes to do. It likes to percolate. And so it can gain access to aquifers adjacent to the facility, which unfortunately is where a lot of people will pull their drinking water. And then there's sort of point source direct impacts where you have bad actors discharging industrial pollution, and SELC is actually involved in that situation in Lumberton right now, where we have a company that is knowingly pumping brownfield contaminated water into the Lumber River. And so you have these individual companies that can do a lot of damage in one spot without proper regulation. But really, far and away, the most damage that the wood pellet industry does to water quality is deforestation and just the widespread clear cuts that short circuit our natural water quality protections. Standing forests, as most of you know, are an essential tool in maintaining water quality. They promote groundwater renewal. When rain falls, they don't let it go anywhere. It stays within that ecosystem, percolates through the soil, and recharges aquifers, which in a time when we're hearing a lot about aquifers being drying up and people not having drinking water, it's essential that we keep our forests intact. They also slow water and limit stormwater runoff pollution, which I'm sure many of you have seen the results of. When you have bare land from a clear cut, you have lots of water washing off. It picks up everything it runs over and deposits into surface waters, which is where some of us get our drinking water, which is where we recreate, and which is where billions of little organisms call their home. So we're allowing an industry to clear cut our best hope of maintaining good water quality writ large across the state. And so as far as what we're doing now, in the short term, and by we, I mean the Sierra Club and our allies that we work with on this issue. And it's been a long haul. This is not an easy issue to wrap your arms around. But in the short term, we're trying to make sure that the permits that are issued are as protective as possible, both for the environment and for the surrounding communities. We want to make sure that polluters and violators are pointed out to the state. So we keep an eye on these guys and make sure that we can provide the evidence needed to hold them accountable. And and at least the Sierra Club and a couple of our allies are working right now within the government itself to try to stop financial incentives at a state level. So this industry can't survive without being propped up. It needs incentives, it needs tax breaks. So if we can cut off money, we can curtail the destruction. In the long term, we're looking to educate the public, which is why we do things like this and have social media campaigns and the like, because we're really looking to raise the alarm on the destruction that's happening in our backyard. And in the future, hoping to help author and certainly support more protective policies, make sure we have accountability for violations for these companies and financial consequences for failure to meet permit requirements. We figured that is the best way that we can help protect water quality, we can help protect forests, is to essentially hamstring this industry by cutting off their financial supply. So I think I did it in 10 minutes. That's
Fantastic.
it. Thank you.
Coming in right at the buzzer at 5 o'clock. Thank you so much, Erin. As it is about to turn 5, I will say, if anyone needs to hop off, including our speakers, feel free to do so. But I think we'll hang around for just a few more minutes to answer any lasting questions and have a wrap up. So I think I'm going to loop back around to lead real quick. There was a question from Lib Hutchby that was regarding water testing on military bases. Ed and Vikki, I'm not sure if you two know too much about that, but who is doing the testing on the military bases? Who does water testing of water from waste treatment plants from military bases? Do either of you know anything along those lines? I know you both work in the child sector of things. So
the only thing, as a public health agency, we do inspections, various restaurants and child care centers and that sort of thing. We don't have primacy to do inspections on military bases. They're considered federal properties. Some counties have been able to coordinate, because they want to get inspected in a lot of cases. Military has requirements for inspections, but they have their own in-house folks who do that. So they were not subject in large part to the child care requirements. I know that some did test because they contacted us, and some even sent test results to us because they wanted us to know that they were okay. They didn't have any water hazards identified. But in large part, I could not tell you who or if water testing is done. I certainly don't know anything about water treatment plants. So.
And Lib also wanted to know, I think in regards to testing in general, is that information publicly available? Is there anywhere that citizens can go to learn the results of testing?
And there sure is. It's all publicly available. Vikki, you wouldn't happen to have the URL or anything for the Clean Water for Kids website?
Yeah, it's in the chat. It's just cleanwaterforcarolinakids.org/data. And that's where folks can look at the whole map and find the results for every child care center that's tested.
Yeah, you have to pretty much look it up by center. I mean, when we designed it, we really weren't thinking this was, for folks who are going to be looking for hot spots or that sort of thing. The data is available. You can request it from us for some research purposes and that sort of thing. But you can look up every center individually and identify. I mean, that was the whole intent, to put a little additional pressure on childcare operators to go ahead and mitigate the problems that we identified was through embarrassment or, the fact that they might lose business, if folks saw that they had not resolved the issues that were identified.
Fantastic. And then I know, let's see, it's the Coastal Conservation Association of North Carolina. I think is how you say that. I had a few questions as well regarding coal ash. Looks like, okay, so they said they're leaving behind coal ash at each plant and the structural fills with no cleanup. Let's see, the question here is, there's a few questions. will the cancer clusters besides the 14 contaminated plants be upgrading their water systems to reverse osmosis? Let's see. Can't see. This is a lot to parse through. I'm gonna put this back in the chat. Nick, if you can just look at this message and give me your best synopsis of your response. Lib is also asking about results for PFAS in water testing. Emily, can you speak to that a little bit? I know that there's no requirements for testing for PFAS, but yeah.
Yeah, so currently there's no federal requirement, which means and that's what the utilities follow at the state and local levels. So if it's not required federally, it's usually not being done unless there's a known contaminated area. So in the Wilmington, Brunswick County area, because we know there's severe contamination, those utilities have been doing regular, like weekly sampling. Now, the state of North Carolina did test the drinking water supply. So they sent a scientist did this research. They went and they tested all of the groundwater, and now, well, they originally tested all of the public drinking water supplies, and they posted that. And you can actually go find it. It's the PFAS network. I think if you Google PFAS network, they have a database. If I have a moment, I'll try and post that in the chat. And you can see how much PFAS is in the drinking water source for the town that you're interested in North Carolina. Now, the little caveat there is that the state legislature funded this project, but the state legislature was very specific that they did not want these scientists to test the finished tap water. So what was coming out of your tap, they only wanted to test what was in the raw water in the and so in the drinking water supply. So the question is, how much ends up in the tap water? What we found down here in North Carolina, based on our understanding of the filtration process, is that these chemicals are very hard and difficult to filter out. So usually what's found in the source water or the drinking water supply is very similar to what's found in the tap water. The most effective method of filtering out PFAS currently is reverse osmosis, but that's a very unsustainable process on large scales. So it's very difficult. If we had all utilities do that, that would be very energy inefficient. It would not be a sustainable move. So the big push that we want is for everybody to address it at the source. We need the EPA and we need DEQ to stop the releases before they get into our drinking water supply so that our utilities don't have to do these astronomical and extreme things like upgrading to reverse osmosis treatment facilities, which can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Hope that answered the question. Oh, one last thing on the federal level, the EPA did approve 29 different PFAS to be included in their unregulated contaminant monitoring, the UCMR 5, which I think is going to come out in 2024 or 2023. I'm not sure, but basically this is just a slate of a handful of different chemicals that are not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but all utilities across the nation are required to sample for these once or quarterly and then submit those results. And so the public does become aware at that point. But again, thresholds are important to pay attention to because this is where all these wonky loopholes fall into place. So if your detection limits aren't set low enough to detect these chemicals, or if the health goals, if there are no health goals established, then the community learns, oh, you've got PFAS in your drinking water, but no one can tell you what that data means other than just you're being exposed. So there's a lot of loopholes. There's a lot of data gaps to close. But the one thing that I do want everyone to realize is that these are endocrine disrupting. They are toxic at trace amounts. And it is becoming, scientists are sounding the alarm in a very, very big way. The EU is starting to ban them just across the board, the chemistry, because they are showing long-term health effects that are costing nations billions in healthcare costs due to interaction. So thanks.
Real quick. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to that a little bit. I posted in the chat one of the maps that Emily was talking about. It's actually through the environmental working group, and they've got a map of a lot of different testing from military sites, from drinking water sites, and other known sites. And it sort of gets at what Emily was talking about too, of it's evolving in terms of like the way in which you can detect different types of PFAS as well. And that map will render it in a sort of confusing way to many people, which is that it breaks it down by type of PFAS. And there, like I was saying before, is like 9,000 different types of PFAS. So the sort of accumulated amount, like the cumulative is generally a decent indicator. But again, with a lot of these chemicals, we're sort of making jumps of, or not jumps, but we're looking at the effects of some of these chemicals on human health and doing it for all of them, just because it's not feasible to test 9,000 different chemicals in any sort of time scale. I don't know if Emily wants to add anything more about that map, but I was just wanting to show, because some of the levels, especially down where Emily is based out of, are incredibly high, several times over the recommended amount of parts per trillion. So not great stuff.
Yeah, Connor, you did a great job. I think I noticed in the chat someone had asked, well, what if private residents started sending in their test results? Yeah, that's possible. It's also very expensive. So, you know, and we're talking, like Connor said, you know, these are thousands and thousands of chemicals. And right now, these commercial labs, if you were to send off to get your water tested, these labs are really only able to sample maybe 70. I think the most comprehensive commercially available test can give you a reading on 70 of these compounds instead of the 4,000 to 9,000 that the EPA says are possibly out in our environment being released. Those tests, by the way, are incredibly expensive. We're looking at like $600. So we have been partnering with a lot of nonprofits to try and get grant money to do some testing and then use that data to leverage action at the state and federal level. I know that I participated in an EWG tap water study. Consumer Reports has done a tap water study. I think the NRDC is currently working on a tap water study. So if we really wanted to be proactive, one thing that we could do from an engagement standpoint is we could demand that the Department of Environmental Quality require all utilities in North Carolina do these tests on their finished water. This is why it's a simple order that DEQ could address. They could just sign it. It's really no money on the state. It's just asking the utilities to order one of these tests and submit those results and have them publicly available. California did this a couple of years ago, and that's how they very, very quickly learned where PFAS was in the actual tap water. So that is one area of advocacy that we could all push for. And yes, you could do your own private sampling. I think that is a great suggestion if you live on a private well, because obviously if you're not on a public supply, then it is up to you to figure that out and make sure that you're being protected.
Thank you so much. I want to quick ask, I saw Lou's question, which was, what do you all need most from volunteers? And that seems like a good question to say to all of our speakers. If you have any contact links, any petition links, or any sort of information that you all want to drop in the chat, I will be saving the chat and going through it, parsing all that information out, sending it out as an email to all the people that made it tonight, as well as those that couldn't. And so, yeah, make sure you have that information in the chat, and I'll make sure that we can pass that on. To kick back over to wood pellets really quickly, there was a question that was, how do we become active to cut off funds to subsidize Enviva? Erin, if you have any thoughts on that or anything in that regard.
Sure, and I dropped my email in the chat. It's erin.carey@sierraclub.org. If anyone would like to contact me about getting involved. The part about the incentives and cutting off money for Enviva, that's very much a wonky tack we're taking. But certainly we could use people in the fight against wood pellets. So if you're interested in just getting involved in that, please please reach out to me. And I can get you connected with the right people, maybe one of them, but there are others.
Fantastic. And let's see. Okay, Emily answered that question in the chat. Interesting. Can someone speak about sustainable aviation fuel? SAF, use of wood pellets as a replacement for crude oil used for producing aviation fuel. Have you heard about that at all, Erin? That's news to me.
I have, yeah. So Enviva recently announced that they were going to double their production in the next 5 years, which, if you're doing the math, means they're going to take twice as many trees in the next 5 years. And they just got a client here in the US, which this was all rumor. I don't know if it's been verified or not, but that this client was interested in using wood pellets to create a renewable aviation fuel. So that's as much as I know about it. Perhaps whoever left that note saw some sort of verification. And I wouldn't doubt if it was true, because certainly aviation fuel burns a lot of carbon. But I did hear that sort of technology was being explored here in the US, which is bad news for trees.
Right. Okay, and I think that's the end of our questions. I think I will pose one final question to each one of our panelists, which is, I guess, how do you all feel? How does it look? Where are we going? Are we in a good place? How much more work needs to be done? I know PFAS is in the early stages. It sounds like lead is in a pretty good state right now. This wood pellet issue seems like it's kind of new. And unfortunately, Nick had to leave for coal ash, so we won't be able to, but I do know, I mean, there's been some huge settlements lately on the coal ash. So I think I can say that we're doing pretty well on the coal ash front. But yeah, Emily, let's start with you.
We're just trying to leverage some of the work that's happening in the EU. So I'd have to say I feel hopeful long term, because usually there's a manufacturing ripple effect. If it happens in one region of the country or one region of the world, it does have an impact on the global economy. So it's positive that the European Union is looking to set really aggressive health standards on PFAS. So we're able to leverage some of that data and information, and that they're banning PFAS. I'm hopeful that they've started to ban PFAS in firefighting foam use at the military level. And so that is really trickling down then to your local firefighters and your volunteer fire stations, which may still be using this toxic form of firefighting foam. And then I think from a consumer product standpoint, which is really the convenience uses, we are seeing some good momentum in getting it out of food packaging, getting it out of rain gear. There's a push right now to sign a petition to get REI to stop providing products that have PFAS in them. So, and then I know that McDonald's had signed on. There's a lot of home improvement industries that have been working as well. So this is still ramping up. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And then one thing to keep an eye on is that the EPA has started to change the definition of what a PFAS is. And that is one thing that is on our radar right now, is that they are carving out a select few, and they're creating a loophole for those. And those PFAS are the ones that the chemical industry are using the most right now. So really convenient, right? So we really are trying to pay attention to that space and make sure that we hold our elected leaders accountable, our agencies accountable, and definitely industry accountable, because if they want to be considered responsible, they should act responsible.
Connor, how about you?
Yeah, I would similarly say that I'm hopeful. When you look at the history of like bills introduced in the US in across different jurisdictional levels, it's generally been like trending up and up every year for those regulating PFAS. Some different states have had different abilities to like regulate different uses of PFAS and whatnot. And I think it's always building on each other. I don't know if we'll get anything large like in the next couple of months type of hope. But I think that as it's true of everything in advocacy, it's sort of like building continually until you get to that point. And like Emily was saying, I think the EU and other like large markets starting to sort of clamp down on it will change the logic for a lot of those people who companies that produce PFAS and make them either reformulate or get out of the business at all. It is a little bit concerning of what Emily was talking about, because that has been sort of a chronic problem with PFAS, is that they'll reformulate what it is, change the definition, change the chemistry, and sort of be able to squeak around the edges of it. So I think generally hopeful, but also got to keep an eye on this very large group of chemicals and how to specifically define it so that we're regulating all of them that can cause human health effects.
Vikki, any last thoughts on lead and where we stand?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the sad truths about this is that lead is one of those toxics that we have decades of solid research about the impact on health. And yet, you know, hundreds of years later, we're still advocating to address lead in different sources. Lead shows up in our water. It also shows up still in a lot of legacy lead paint in older homes, in imported spices and toys. And so the work continues. And I think what we've learned from, you know, working on this toxic metal is that even with all of that solid research, it takes a ton of public pressure and community organizing to move the needle even a little bit. And so I think that really tells us that we just need to keep up the work and not back down, and that work continues for the other issues as well, I think.
How about you, Ed?
So yeah, we've got our work cut out, you know, trying to figure out how to test all these schools and hopefully be able to distribute the mitigation funds. And I mentioned, you know, the water world is kind of new to me. It's not been my focus for 30 years. Where we really haven't made as much progress is with the children. I mean, we test over 100,000 children every year in North Carolina. And, you know, we're identifying more than 500 of them, you know, with elevations. I think that's the bigger challenge, and the fact that we don't have resources to address typically, you know, privately owned homes. It's usually a landlord involved. You know, it's not your typical environmental issue, but it is a child's environment, and it's one that, you know, we're going to stay focused on, you know, for the long term. I don't think childhood lead poisoning is going to go away, even if we, you know, get rid of all the lead in water and, you know, at schools and childcare centers, and lead paint at schools and childcare centers. Residential poisoning is where it typically occurs. But I'm optimistic because, you know, we completed this entire child care testing project during the pandemic. You know, and there was actually another question that I saw related to that, because the way that we're testing is our contractor, RTI International, is mailing out test kits to the child care operator. So they do the initial testing after doing pretty extensive online training on how to do that. I mean, it's not rocket science how to take a, you know, a water sample, but you've got to know which faucets you want to sample from. You know, we're not trying to test every outdoor spigot that's not supposed to be used for drinking anyway. And we never would have been able to afford, you know, to test every single tap at child care centers or schools. But we are focusing on the ones that, you know, are most likely to be of greatest concern to kids. And the fact that we were able to do that over the course of a couple of years, really, during the pandemic, you know, gives me great optimism that, you know, we'll be successful in this next stage with schools.
Awesome. And finally, last but definitely not least, Erin, any final thoughts?
I mean, I'm hopeful, because you don't do this kind of work if you're not just generally hopeful. But I think one of the things that stands out to me, the difference between the wood pellet issue and the other issues discussed today is the sort of the universal recognition of coal ash and PFAS and lead, that it's a bad thing. And we don't have that universal recognition yet. So I think moving forward, yes, I'm hopeful we can make some change, but what we really need to do is educate the public so we can get that grassroots support and start putting pressure on our decision makers, on our leaders in Raleigh to make changes and stop incentivizing this industry.
Well, with that, I just want to say thank you for everyone. First of all, thank you to our speakers for hanging on for another 23 minutes or so here as we wrap things up. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your time. And thanks for everyone who came out tonight. Really appreciate it. I think we're in a pretty good state. There's as all of our panelists said, there's always more work to be done. But you know, the more events like this that we hold, the more people we educate, then the more that we can see some progress. But yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Water is life. Don't forget it. Bye, y'all.
Bye, thanks.